There is a moment most people have had at least once. You are sitting in a conversation, or reading something, or watching someone work through a problem, and something catches your attention. Not what they say, exactly, but the way they say it, the way they hold the idea, the way they turn it around slowly, examine it from an angle you had not thought to look from, and then arrive somewhere that feels both surprising and completely obvious at the same time. And you think to yourself, how do they do that? Sometimes you assume they are simply smarter, that they were born with something you were not. That intelligence is a fixed quantity handed out at birth in unequal measure, and that some people simply received more of it than others. That assumption is understandable. It is also, in important ways, incomplete. Because when you study the people who think clearly, who learn consistently, who make better decisions over time, who seem to understand things more deeply than others, you begin to notice something that does not fit the story of fixed intelligence. You begin to notice that what separates them from others is not primarily what they know, it is what they do. Repeatedly, without much fanfare, almost invisibly. It is their habits, not the dramatic habits, not the early morning routines designed to be impressive, not the reading lists carefully curated for appearance, the quiet habits, the ones that happen in the gaps between visible effort, the ones that look, from the outside, like nothing is happening at all. This audiobook is about those habits. It is about the daily practices that shape how you think, not just what you think about. It is about the small, consistent behaviors that compound over months and years into something that looks, from the outside, like natural intelligence. And before we go any further, there is one thing worth saying clearly. This audiobook is not going to tell you that you can become a genius. It is not going to promise that a few simple tricks will rewire your brain overnight. Those promises exist in abundance, and they tend to dissolve on contact with reality. What this audiobook will tell you is something quieter and, in the long run, far more useful. It will tell you that intelligence, in the most practical and meaningful sense of the word, is not a fixed ceiling above your head. It is a direction. It is a quality of attention. It is a set of choices made repeatedly over time about how you engage with the world around you and the thoughts inside your own mind. It will tell you that the gap between someone who thinks clearly and someone who does not is rarely a gap in raw brain power. It is more often a gap in habits, in practices, in the small, daily decisions about whether to think carefully or to think carelessly, whether to observe or to overlook, whether to question or to accept, whether to reflect or to react. You can close that gap, not by becoming someone else, not by performing intelligence or mimicking the surface behaviors of people you admire, but by genuinely changing the way you think at the level of habit, at the level of daily practice, at the level of what your mind does when no one is watching and nothing is forcing it to perform. This is a process that happens slowly. It happens in moments that do not feel significant. It happens in the pause before you answer a question. It happens in the decision to read one more page or put the book down. It happens in the willingness to sit with uncertainty instead of rushing toward the nearest comfortable answer. But it does happen, and the people who understand this, who take it seriously and act on it consistently, find over time that the way they think has changed, that they see things others miss, that they make fewer regrettable decisions, that they learn faster, not because they are trying harder, but because they have built a mind that is more receptive to learning. That is what this audiobook is about. Not intelligence as a trait you have or do not have. Intelligence as a practice, as a discipline, as a direction you choose to move in every day through the habits you build and maintain. We are going to move through this carefully. There is no rush. The ideas here deserve space, because the goal is not for you to finish this audiobook and immediately feel smarter. The goal is for you to finish it and think differently, to carry something forward into the way you move through your day, the way you engage with ideas, the way you make decisions. That is a slower process than a list of tips, but it is a real one, and it begins with understanding why most people stop growing mentally long before they reach the limits of what they are capable of. Most people do not stop learning because they run out of capacity. They stop growing because they stop noticing. There is a shift that happens subtly somewhere in adulthood for most people. In childhood, you are constantly encountering things for the first time. The world is relentlessly new. Every experience contains something to figure out, something to wonder about, something that does not yet have a place in your understanding of how things work. The mind is active by necessity. Then, gradually, the world becomes more familiar. You develop frameworks. You accumulate patterns. The neural pathways involved in everyday thinking become worn, and the brain, which is extraordinarily efficient, begins to rely on those established routes. It stops expending the effort required to think freshly about familiar things. This is not a failure of character. It is, in many ways, a feature of how the brain works. Efficiency has enormous survival value. The ability to respond automatically to familiar situations frees up cognitive resources for genuinely new challenges. But there is a cost. When you stop thinking freshly, you also stop updating. You stop questioning the assumptions that are quietly running in the background of every decision you make. You stop noticing the details that do not fit your existing picture. You stop learning from experience in any deep sense because you are not really examining your experiences anymore. You are just passing through them. This is what mental stagnation looks like. Not dramatic, not obviously visible, just a slow narrowing of the mind's active engagement with the world. And it is more common than most people realize. Consider how much of your day is spent in genuinely active thinking versus automatic processing. You drive the same route and arrive without remembering the journey. You have conversations in which you are largely waiting for your turn to speak rather than truly listening to what is being said. You read an article and absorb the conclusion without examining the reasoning behind it. You form opinions quickly, based on pattern matching with things you already believe, and those opinions then become resistant to revision. None of this is unusual. It is the default setting of a mind that has not been deliberately trained otherwise. And here is the thing about defaults. They feel natural. They feel like the way things simply are, rather than like a choice you are making. The person who never questions their assumptions does not feel like someone who has stopped thinking. They feel like someone who knows what they know. The person who never reflects on their decisions does not feel incurious. They feel efficient, practical, unburdened by unnecessary rumination. The default state of mental stagnation has a quality of comfort to it, and that comfort is part of what makes it so persistent. There is also something else at work, which is worth naming directly. Many people are quietly afraid of not knowing. They have built an identity around competence, around having answers, around being someone who understands how things work. To genuinely question that understanding, to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty, to entertain the possibility that you have been wrong about something for a long time, can feel threatening in a way that is hard to articulate, so the mind avoids it. Not through dramatic resistance, but through the gentle, constant work of confirmation. You read what confirms what you already think. You listen more carefully to people who agree with you than to people who challenge you. You remember the evidence that supports your positions and gloss over the evidence that complicates them. This is not stupidity. It is a very human response to the discomfort of cognitive uncertainty. But it has a significant intellectual cost. The people who continue to grow mentally, who continue to develop their thinking well into adulthood and beyond, share a quality that is worth understanding clearly. They have made peace with not knowing. They have found a way to be comfortable with uncertainty, not because they are indifferent to being right, but because they have come to value the process of inquiry more than the comfort of premature conclusion. They stay curious. They remain genuinely open to revision. They find the experience of having their mind changed by good evidence or a compelling argument not threatening, but satisfying. This is not a personality trait that you either have or you do not. It is a practice. It is something you can cultivate, and it begins, as so many things do, with a shift in what you pay attention to and how. The other pattern worth understanding in people who stop growing mentally is the relationship with difficulty. Thinking carefully is effortful. Genuine reflection takes time and mental energy. Questioning assumptions creates friction. These are not metaphors. Cognitive effort is a real expenditure of mental resources, and the brain is designed to minimize that expenditure wherever possible. This means that deep thinking, by default, gets displaced by shallow thinking, not because you are lazy, but because shallow thinking is easier, faster, and in most situations, sufficient for immediate purposes. The habit that separates those who continue to grow from those who plateau is the willingness to choose the effortful path when it matters. Not always, not exhaustingly, but consistently enough that the capacity for genuine thought is exercised regularly rather than allowed to atrophy. Think of it like physical fitness. A person who never exercises does not feel the loss of fitness acutely from one day to the next. The decline is gradual and largely invisible until some significant demand reveals it. Mental fitness works similarly. A mind that is never challenged, never asked to engage with something genuinely difficult or new, does not obviously feel diminished. It just quietly narrows. The habits in this audiobook are, in a sense, a form of mental exercise, not performed for its own sake, but practiced because the capacity they develop has real consequences for how you navigate your life, your work, and your relationships. Let us begin with the first of those habits, the one that is, perhaps, the most foundational of all, the habit of observation. Look around you right now, not a cursory glance. Actually look, notice the quality of the light, notice where the shadows fall, notice the sounds in the background that you had filtered out before the instruction to listen. Notice the temperature of the air on your skin. Notice the arrangement of things in your field of vision, the way they relate to each other in space. You can do all of this in about 30 seconds. And in that 30 seconds, you have probably noticed things that you had been physically present with for minutes or hours without registering. That gap, the distance between what is present and what you actually notice, is where the habit of observation lives. And it is a much larger gap than most people realize. Human perception is selective by design. The brain receives an enormous volume of sensory information at every moment, and it cannot process all of it consciously, so it filters. It prioritizes what is novel, what is threatening, what is relevant to current goals, and what changes relative to what came before. Everything else gets suppressed, deprioritized, allowed to pass through without being consciously registered. This is necessary and useful, but it means that the picture of the world you experience at any given moment is not the world itself. It is a highly curated, heavily filtered reconstruction of the world, a model built by your brain, shaped by your expectations, your habits of attention, and your existing beliefs about how things work. Here is what makes this intellectually important. If your model of the world is based only on what your filtered perception allows through, then your understanding of the world is bounded by the assumptions that shape that filtering. You see what you expect to see. You notice what you are primed to notice. You miss what does not fit the pattern, and by missing it, you never have the opportunity to update the pattern. The habit of observation is the practice of deliberately widening that filter, of choosing, with some regularity, to look more carefully than the default, to attend to what is actually present rather than to your mental representation of what should be present. This sounds simple. It is genuinely difficult to sustain, because the mind is always pulling back toward the efficient default, toward the familiar, toward the already known. Genuine observation requires a kind of resistance against that pull, a willingness to slow down, to linger, to allow the world to be more complex and more interesting than your current model of it. The people who do this well do not typically look like they are making an effort. They look like they are simply present. They are the ones in a conversation who catch the slight hesitation in someone's voice that suggests something being left unsaid. They are the ones who walk into a room and notice the change in atmosphere before they could articulate what produced it. They are the ones who read a text and notice what is emphasized, what is omitted, and what the structure of the argument reveals about its assumptions. None of these things are the product of superior intelligence in some abstract sense. They are the product of a sustained habit of paying careful attention. Let us think about what this habit actually looks like in practice. The first element is slowing down. Observation requires time. Not a lot of time, necessarily, but more time than the default pace of modern life tends to allow. When you move through experiences quickly, checking them off, consuming them efficiently, you are not observing them. You are processing them just enough to respond to them and move on. The practice of slowing down does not mean being inefficient. It means choosing, with some regularity, to stay with an experience a little longer than feels necessary, to look at something a second time, to let a conversation pause before you fill the silence, to walk somewhere and actually see the route rather than just arriving. This is not about being precious or deliberate to the point of paralysis. It is about building a habit of lingering attention, a recognition that there is almost always more to notice than the first impression reveals. The second element is active looking versus passive seeing. There is a quality of attention in genuine observation that is distinct from the ordinary visual processing of moving through the world. It involves a kind of intentional engagement, a deliberate choice to look for something, even if that something is simply what is actually here. Artists are often described as seeing differently from other people, and in a sense they do. Not because their eyes work differently, but because they have trained themselves to look actively rather than passively, to notice the specific quality of a color rather than simply categorizing it as blue, to see the particular shape of a shadow rather than treating shadow as a generic concept, to attend to the specific rather than collapsing everything into categories. This active quality of looking transfers to domains far beyond visual art. When you read actively, you notice not just what is argued, but how it is argued, what assumptions are embedded, where the logic holds and where it strains. When you listen actively, you hear not just the content of what is said, but the way it is said, what is avoided, what seems important to the speaker, and what they seem to need from the conversation. Active looking is a form of intellectual engagement, and like any form of engagement, it can become habitual, but only if it is practiced. The third element of the observation habit is what might be called noticing the gap between what is expected and what is actually present, the gap between what is said and what is meant, the gap between how something appears on the surface and what it looks like when examined more carefully. This is where much of the most interesting information lies, and it is almost always invisible at the default level of attention. Think about how you form opinions about people. Most of the time, you are working from a fairly coarse impression, a general sense of someone based on a handful of observable characteristics colored heavily by your existing associations and past experiences. That impression then becomes self-reinforcing because you interpret subsequent observations through its lens. The habit of noticing the gap involves asking, regularly, is this impression actually supported by what I am observing? Or am I seeing what I expect to see? This is not the same as being suspicious of everyone or refusing to form any judgments. It is the practice of holding your impressions a little more lightly, of staying open to the evidence that complicates them, of being genuinely curious about what is actually there rather than satisfied with what your first reading tells you. The fourth element is developing a vocabulary for what you observe. One of the interesting constraints on observation is that we tend to notice things more clearly when we have a language for them. A botanist walks through a forest and notices plant species that a non-botanist walks past without registering, not because the botanist's eyes are better, but because the botanist has a rich vocabulary of categories that creates natural hooks for observation. The different leaf shapes, the growth patterns, the relationships between species, these become visible because there are names for them, because they have been carved out of the general blur of green things. This principle applies across every domain of knowledge and experience. The more vocabulary you have for something, the more finely you can perceive it, not in a mechanical, jargon-dependent way, but in the sense that having articulated distinctions allows you to notice them. Learning about something, genuinely learning, expands your capacity to observe it, and observing more carefully generates new things to learn. This is one of the ways that the habits in this audiobook reinforce each other. Observation feeds learning, learning deepens observation, and both of them, over time, create a richer, more finely detailed picture of the world. The fifth element of observation is learning to read patterns. A single observation tells you something. Multiple observations, held together and compared, tell you much more. The habit of pattern recognition is a natural extension of careful observation. When you attend carefully to individual experiences, you begin to notice when they repeat, when they vary, when they contradict each other, when they collectively suggest something that none of them individually reveal. This is not the same as confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to notice patterns that confirm what you already believe and to overlook patterns that challenge it. The habit of genuine pattern recognition requires holding what you observe lightly enough that disconfirming evidence can register. The person who has cultivated this habit notices, over time, which of their beliefs consistently fail to predict outcomes accurately. They notice when their mental models produce surprises, and they treat those surprises as information, not as anomalies to be explained away. There is something important to say about the emotional quality of this habit. Good observers are, almost universally, curious people, not in a performative or academic sense, but in the sense that they find the world genuinely interesting. They are not going through the motions of observation as a discipline. They are attending carefully because they actually want to know what is there. Curiosity is both a driver and a product of the observation habit. It drives you to look more carefully, and looking more carefully, consistently, produces the small rewards of noticing things others miss, of understanding connections that were invisible before, of having your picture of the world quietly enriched in ways that make it more interesting to inhabit. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle that, over time, becomes characteristic of a certain kind of mind. A mind that is genuinely interested in the world. That approaches experience with receptivity rather than with the closed efficiency of someone who already knows everything they need to know. To build this habit, you do not need to overhaul your life. You need to introduce small practices that, maintained consistently, gradually shift the default quality of your attention. Pay attention to one thing each day that you would ordinarily overlook. A conversation, a piece of writing, a familiar rote, an interaction that passes by quickly. Give it a little more time. Ask yourself what you actually notice when you look more carefully, not what you expected to notice. What is actually there? Read things that give you new vocabulary for existing experiences, not to acquire information for its own sake, but because new categories expand what you can perceive. Practice the habit of the second look. When you form an impression, hold it for a moment and ask whether it is actually grounded in observation or whether it is the product of an existing pattern. Both are valid, but knowing which is which matters. and cultivate a quiet appreciation for what you notice when you pay attention. Not pride, just interest. The small reward of seeing something clearly, of catching a detail that matters, of understanding something a little more deeply than you did before. Over time, this changes the relationship between you and your experience of the world. The world becomes denser, more textured, more interesting, and your thinking, because it is grounded in richer observation, becomes correspondingly more nuanced and more accurate. Observation is not just a habit. It is the foundation upon which everything else in this audiobook is built, because you cannot think clearly about what you have not truly seen. There is a difference between thinking and deep thinking. Most of what passes for thinking in everyday life is something closer to reaction. Something happens, a feeling arises, a conclusion forms quickly, shaped more by emotion and habit and past association than by careful analysis. The conclusion feels like the product of thought because you are conscious during its formation. But the process is largely automatic. Deep thinking is something different. It is slower. It is more deliberate. It involves holding an idea for longer than is comfortable, turning it around, examining it from multiple angles, asking what you might have missed, and being willing to arrive somewhere genuinely different from where you started. Most people do very little of it, not because they are incapable, but because the conditions for deep thinking are rarely present in the way most people organize their time and attention. Deep thinking requires quiet, not necessarily silence, but a reduction in competing demands on your attention. It requires time, more time than a quick conclusion needs. It requires a tolerance for the discomfort of not yet knowing, which means remaining with a problem rather than reaching for the first available answer. In a world organized around speed, around constant stimulation, around the relentless availability of information and distraction, these conditions are increasingly rare, and the capacity for deep thinking, in people who do not deliberately cultivate it, tends to atrophy accordingly. This is worth taking seriously, because deep thinking is where most of the genuine intellectual work gets done. Observation gives you raw material, but it is reflection, sustained analysis, careful reasoning that transforms raw material into understanding. Let us explore what deep thinking actually involves. The first element is reflection. Reflection is the practice of returning to an experience, an idea, or a decision after the fact, and examining it more carefully than you were able to in the moment. It is the opposite of moving on, of treating each experience as a checkpoint to be passed and left behind. Most people are in the habit of moving forward. The next thing is always waiting, the next task, the next conversation, the next piece of content. Stopping to look back, to examine what just happened, to extract learning from it, feels like inefficiency. But this is where much of the most valuable learning happens. When you reflect on a decision you made, you can examine the reasoning behind it in a way that you could not in the moment when you were under pressure to decide. You can ask, what did I actually know when I made that choice? What did I assume that turned out to be wrong? What would I do differently now, and why? When you reflect on a conversation, you can notice things you were too caught up in to register in real time. The moment when the dynamic shifted, the thing you said that came out differently than you intended, the point at which the other person became less engaged or more. Reflection is not rumination. Rumination is the painful, repetitive cycling over what went wrong, driven by self-criticism and anxiety. Reflection is the calm, curious examination of experience in order to understand it better. The distinction lies in the quality of the attention. Rumination is emotionally agitated and backward, looking in a punishing way. Reflection is intellectually engaged and forward, looking, oriented toward learning. Building a reflective practice does not require hours of journaling or formal meditation. It requires carving out small, regular windows of time in which you deliberately return to your experience and examine it. Even 10 minutes of genuine reflection at the end of a day can produce a quality of learning from experience that most people never achieve. The second element of deep thinking is analysis. Analysis is the practice of taking something apart in order to understand how it works. It involves identifying the components of a problem, a situation, or an argument, and examining the relationships between them. It involves asking not just what is happening, but why. Not just what is said, but whether the reasoning holds. Most people engage with information at the level of conclusions. They receive an argument and evaluate whether the conclusion feels right, rather than whether the reasoning actually supports it. They read a story and absorb the narrative without examining the assumptions embedded in how it is framed. Analytical thinking involves a kind of deliberate deceleration, a willingness to stop at each step of a piece of reasoning and ask, is this valid? Does this follow from what came before? Is there a gap here, a leap that has been glossed over? What would I need to believe for this conclusion to be correct? This is not about being contentious or finding fault for its own sake. It is about not being moved along by the current of a persuasive presentation before you have had a chance to evaluate the substance of what is being claimed. The habit of analysis also involves looking for alternative explanations. When you observe something, or when someone offers you an explanation for why something happened, the analytical impulse is to ask, is this the only possible explanation? What else could account for this? Which explanation is best supported by the available evidence? This kind of thinking is genuinely difficult. It requires mental flexibility, the ability to hold multiple explanations in mind simultaneously and to evaluate them against each other rather than defaulting to the first one that seems plausible. But it is the kind of thinking that produces the most accurate picture of how things actually work. And it is learnable, not in a sudden breakthrough, but through repeated practice. The third element of deep thinking is synthesis. Synthesis is the ability to connect ideas from different domains to identify the underlying pattern that links things that look different on the surface and to build from those connections a more integrated understanding of the world. This is, in many ways, the most creative dimension of intelligence, and it is almost entirely a function of exposure combined with the habit of looking for connections. People who think well across domains are people who have spent time thinking carefully in multiple domains. Not as specialists sealed into a single field, but as generalists who move between areas of knowledge and notice the structural similarities beneath the surface differences. The physicist who recognizes that the mathematics of one phenomenon mirrors the mathematics of a seemingly unrelated one and uses that insight to illuminate both. The writer who brings the analytical tools of one discipline to the material of another and produces an understanding that neither discipline could have reached on its own. The manager who recognizes that the dynamics of a team conflict mirror the dynamics they have observed in other contexts and applies what they learned there. Synthesis is not available to a mind that has only ever thought about one thing. And it is not available to a mind that thinks about many things but never looks for connections between them. The habit of synthesis involves actively asking, when you encounter a new idea, where have I seen something like this before? What does this remind me of? How does this connect to something I already understand? It also involves the willingness to read and think across domains rather than staying within the comfortable boundaries of what you already know. Not randomly, but with the orientation of a mind that is looking for underlying patterns, for structural similarities, for the connections that are only visible to someone who is looking for them. The fourth element of deep thinking is sitting with complexity. One of the most reliable markers of shallow thinking is the tendency to simplify prematurely, to reduce a complex situation to a simple story, to see problems as having a single cause, decisions as having a clearly right answer, and people as fitting neatly into categories. This tendency is understandable. The world is genuinely complex, and complexity is cognitively exhausting. Simplification is a necessary tool. Without it, we could not function. Without it, every decision would be paralyzed by the infinite web of factors that could be considered relevant. But there is a difference between useful simplification and premature simplification. Useful simplification retains the essential structure of the thing being modeled. Premature simplification discards information that is actually important in order to reach comfort or certainty faster than the evidence warrants. Deep thinking involves the willingness to hold complexity, to resist the pull toward premature simplification, to stay with the genuine difficulty of a problem rather than reaching for a story that makes it feel simpler than it is. This requires what the psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described in other contexts as a tolerance for ambiguity, the capacity to remain productive and engaged in the presence of uncertainty, rather than being driven by the discomfort of not knowing toward the nearest available resolution. This is a capacity that can be developed. Like a muscle that builds through use, the tolerance for complexity grows stronger with practice. Each time you resist the pull toward premature simplification, each time you choose to stay with a difficult problem a little longer, each time you entertain the possibility that both things are true, or that the most honest answer is that you do not yet know. The fifth element is the discipline of examining your own thinking. This is sometimes called metacognition, and it is one of the most powerful tools available to anyone who wants to think more clearly. Most people think about the world. Fewer people think about their own thinking, about the processes and assumptions and biases that shape the conclusions they reach, about the moments when their reasoning is sound and the moments when it is being quietly hijacked by emotion, by fatigue, by the desire to reach a comfortable conclusion. The habit of examining your own thinking involves a kind of internal observer, a quiet part of your attention that is watching the thinking process itself, not just participating in it, noticing when you are reasoning carefully and when you are rationalizing, noticing when you are genuinely uncertain and when the feeling of certainty is running ahead of the evidence, noticing when you are thinking clearly and when something is getting in the way. This takes practice, and it requires a quality of intellectual honesty that is genuinely difficult to sustain, because the most important moments for self-examination are precisely the moments when you feel most certain, when you are most convinced that you already know the answer and therefore have no need to examine the thinking more carefully. Those moments of certainty are where most intellectual errors lie. The people who think most clearly are, in a subtle but important way, the least certain, not paralyzed by doubt, not incapable of action or decision, but holding their conclusions a little more lightly, a little more provisionally, than the people around them might expect, because they know from experience how often confident conclusions turn out to need revision, and they have learned to find that revision not threatening but interesting, not a defeat, but a sign that their picture of the world is getting more accurate. Building the habit of deep thinking begins with creating the conditions for it. That means protecting time for genuine reflection, not just scheduled into your calendar, but held against the constant pressure of competing demands. It means choosing regularly to think something through more carefully than you strictly need to sit with a problem before reaching for an answer, to return to something you thought you understood and ask whether you actually do. It means reading things that require you to follow complex arguments, engaging with ideas that resist easy absorption, choosing depth over breadth with some regularity, even in a world that rewards breadth. And it means cultivating intellectual humility, not as a performance of modesty, but as a genuine recognition that thinking well is difficult, that error is always possible, and that the mind that stays genuinely open to revision is the mind that, over time, gets closest to the truth. Every thought you have, every idea you form, every decision you make begins with attention. Attention is not just what you notice, it is what you become. It is the raw material from which your understanding of the world, your relationships, your decisions, and your sense of who you are all built. The quality of your attention determines, in ways that are easy to underestimate, the quality of your inner life and your outer effectiveness. And yet attention is something that most people have almost no intentional relationship with. Most people experience attention as something that happens to them, something that goes where it wants, pulled by whatever is most stimulating or most urgent in the environment. Something to be managed in crisis, but largely left to its own devices the rest of the time. The habit of controlling attention is the practice of changing that relationship, of developing a genuine, ongoing capacity to direct your attention deliberately rather than simply following wherever it is pulled. This is one of the most difficult habits in this audiobook, and it is one of the most consequential. Let us begin with what makes attention so difficult to control. The human attention system was not designed for the world you currently inhabit. It was designed for an environment in which novelty signaled potential danger or opportunity, and in which paying attention to the most stimulating thing in your field of awareness was generally a sound survival strategy. The mind is designed to be pulled toward what is bright, what is moving, what is loud, what is unexpected. In the environment you actually live in, this design creates significant problems, because the world around you is now filled with stimuli that have been deliberately engineered to exploit the natural biases of your attention system. Notifications designed to feel urgent, content designed to be endlessly novel, platforms designed to make switching away feel like a loss, inputs designed to keep the attention moving, always moving, never settling long enough to go deep. The result, for many people, is an attention system that is chronically fractured, that has lost much of its capacity for sustained, directed focus. That defaults to a kind of low-level, perpetual distraction that feels like engagement, but produces very little in the way of genuine understanding or creative thought. This is not a moral failing. It is an adaptation to a genuinely challenging environment, but it has consequences, because the kind of thinking that matters most, the analysis, the reflection, the synthesis, the careful reasoning, all of it requires sustained attention. It cannot happen in fragments. It cannot be done in the gaps between notifications. It requires the kind of deep, uninterrupted focus that has become increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. The first element of controlling attention is understanding the difference between focused and diffuse thinking. Focused thinking is the mode of concentrated, directed attention, the attention you bring to a problem when you are working on it deliberately, following a chain of reasoning, holding a complex idea in mind while you examine it. This is the mode associated with careful analysis and logical thinking. Diffuse thinking is the more relaxed, unfocused mode in which the mind makes connections more freely, draws on a wider range of associations, and often produces the insights that feel like they come from nowhere. This is the mode that activates when you step away from a problem, when you take a walk, when you let your mind wander. Both modes are important. Both play essential roles in high-quality thinking. The mistake is not in having both, but in failing to create the conditions for either to work properly. Most people's lives are organized in a way that undermines both. The constant availability of stimulation prevents genuine diffuse thinking, because the mind is always being pulled back to a new input before it can settle into productive wandering, and the fragmentation of attention prevents genuine focused thinking, because concentration requires a period of uninterrupted engagement that is increasingly hard to find. The practice of controlling attention involves, among other things, deliberately creating the conditions for both modes, protecting time for concentrated work without interruption, and allowing genuine unstructured time in which the mind can wander without being immediately grabbed by a new input. The second element is understanding attention as a resource that depletes and recovers. Concentration is not unlimited. The capacity for directed, Effortful attention is a resource that exhausts over the course of sustained use and recovers with rest. This is one of the reasons why the quality of your thinking tends to deteriorate when you are tired or when you have been working intensely for a long time without a break. Understanding this resource model of attention has practical implications. It means that what you do with your attention in the early, high-quality hours of your day matters more than what you do with it when you are depleted. It means that recovery is not a luxury but a necessary component of sustained performance. And it means that decisions made about how to spend your attention should take into account not just the immediate cost but the downstream effect on the quality of the thinking that follows. Many people spend their highest quality attention on the lowest quality demands, on checking messages, on responding to whatever is most urgent in the moment, on the reactive management of incoming information, and then find themselves trying to do their most important thinking on the dregs of attention that remain. Reversing this pattern, protecting the early and high-quality windows for the work that requires the most concentrated thought, is one of the highest leverage changes most people can make to the quality of their thinking. The third element is the practice of single tasking. Multitasking is, for most cognitive purposes, a myth. What feels like doing two things simultaneously is almost always rapid switching between them. And each switch has a cost, a reorientation period in which the mind must re-establish the context it left when it switched away. For tasks that are largely automatic, this switching cost is low, but for tasks that require concentrated thought, it is significant. The state of deep focus, the productive immersion in a problem or a piece of work, takes time to enter and is instantly destroyed by interruption. Every time you switch your attention away from focused work, you are not just pausing. You are exiting a state that took effort to build and will require effort to rebuild. The habit of single tasking, of giving one thing your full, undivided attention for a sustained period, is counter-cultural in a world that celebrates business and multitasking as signs of productivity and importance. But it is the habit that makes the deepest thinking possible. This does not mean never checking your phone or never responding to messages. It means doing those things in dedicated windows, rather than allowing them to continuously fragment the attention you are trying to bring to more important work. It means choosing for some portion of each day to be fully present with one thing. The fourth element is the deliberate direction of attention in conversation and in reading. Attention is not just about managing distractions in your environment. It is also about the quality of presence you bring to the interactions and the ideas you encounter. In conversation, the habit of controlled attention means genuinely listening rather than waiting to speak. It means attending to what is actually being said, the specific words, the emotional undercurrent, the thing that is almost being said, but is not quite making it to the surface. It means resisting the pull to formulate your response while the other person is still speaking, which is not listening. It is something that looks like listening from the outside while the mind is actually occupied elsewhere. In reading, controlled attention means actively engaging with what is on the page, rather than allowing the eyes to move over words while the mind drifts. It means pausing when you encounter something that requires thought rather than allowing the momentum of consumption to carry you past it. It means bringing genuine curiosity to what you are reading rather than simply processing words for their informational content. Both of these require a quality of intentional presence that is quite different from the default state of a mind that has been conditioned by constant stimulation. The fifth element is developing an awareness of attention hijacks. Not all pulls on your attention are external. Some are internal. The anxious thought that keeps intruding. The unresolved problem that keeps surfacing. The emotionally charged memory that pulls the mind away from whatever you are trying to concentrate on. These internal hijacks are often more difficult to manage than external distractions because you cannot simply put them down or turn them off. They require a different approach. The most useful approach is not suppression, but acknowledgement. When an intrusive thought arises during concentrated work, the most effective response is often to briefly acknowledge it, to note it without engaging with it in depth, and to consciously return your attention to the task at hand. This is a skill that develops with practice, and it is central to the kind of mental discipline that makes sustained focus possible. Meditation practices, particularly those that involve training the attention on a single object and gently returning when the mind wanders, are one effective way to build this capacity. But the underlying skill, the capacity to notice when your attention has been pulled away and to intentionally bring it back, can be cultivated through any activity that requires sustained, directed focus, and that provides clear feedback when the focus is lost. The sixth element is the quality of attention in idle moments. What you do with the spaces in your day matters more than most people recognize. The waiting, the commuting, the transitions between activities. These moments used to contain some natural downtime, some unstructured space in which the mind could settle and wander. For many people now, these moments are immediately filled with stimulation. The phone comes out the moment there is nothing demanding attention. The podcast goes on the moment there is silence. The constant input has displaced the natural fallow time that the mind needs for restoration and integration. The habit of sometimes allowing idle moments to simply be idle is a quiet but significant act of mental discipline. Not every moment needs to be filled. Not every silence needs to be resolved. Allowing your mind to wander without immediately redirecting it toward fresh input is, counterintuitively, one of the most restorative and creatively productive things you can do. The connections that feel most surprising, the insights that seem to arrive from nowhere, very often arrive in the quiet moments when the mind has been allowed to work without being consciously directed. Protecting some of that space is worth more than filling it. Building the habit of controlled attention is, in some ways, a lifelong practice, because the forces working against it are constant and powerful. But the rewards are equally constant. A mind that can direct its attention deliberately, that can sustain focused engagement with what matters most, that can remain present in conversation and genuinely absorbed in reading and thinking, is a mind that does far more with what it encounters. That extracts more understanding from experience. That thinks more clearly when thinking clearly is most needed. Attention is the beginning of everything. Control it with intention, and you begin to control the quality of your own mind. Intelligence does not grow in isolation. It grows through contact with ideas, experiences, and perspectives that are genuinely new, through the repeated encounter with things that do not fit your existing understanding and the work of making sense of them. Through the gradual, cumulative expansion of what you know and, more importantly, of how you think. The habit of continuous learning is what keeps the mind growing. It is the practice that prevents intellectual stagnation and keeps curiosity alive. And it is a habit, which means it is not something that happens automatically. It is something that must be chosen, structured, and maintained. Most people learn a great deal in the first quarter of their lives and then, without entirely noticing it, begin to slow down. Not because the capacity to learn diminishes, though some adjustments do occur with age, but because the conditions that drove learning in youth, formal education, new environments, the necessity of figuring things out from scratch, are no longer present. And without those external conditions driving it, learning becomes voluntary. And voluntary learning requires a different kind of motivation and structure than externally required learning does. The people who continue to grow intellectually throughout their lives are those who have internalized the motivation to learn, who find the expansion of their understanding genuinely rewarding, not because it leads to external recognition or credential, but because the experience of understanding more than you did yesterday is in itself satisfying. This is the foundation of the habit, not discipline for its own sake, not learning as a performance of self-improvement, but genuine curiosity, genuine engagement with the pleasure of understanding. Let us think carefully about what continuous learning actually involves. The first element is reading broadly and deeply. Reading is still, despite the abundance of other media, the most efficient mechanism most people have for engaging with ideas in a sustained, structured way. A well-written book or essay gives you access to someone else's careful thought, organized and expressed over many hours or years of work, in a form that you can engage with at your own pace, pause over, return to, and think about. The habit of reading broadly means crossing the borders of your existing areas of knowledge with some regularity. Not randomly or without direction, but with the recognition that the most interesting insights often come from domains you do not usually inhabit, and that the frameworks you have built in one area often illuminate things in another in ways you could not have anticipated. The habit of reading deeply means engaging with some of what you read with genuine concentration and reflection. Not just absorbing information, but thinking about it. Following the arguments. Noticing where you agree and where you resist. Asking what implications this has for things you already believe. Both habits are valuable, and they are not in conflict. Broad reading expands the range of ideas you have been exposed to. Deep reading builds the capacity to engage with ideas with genuine rigor. The second element is learning from people, not just from texts. Some of the most valuable learning that happens in a life happens in conversation. In the sustained engagement with people whose experience, perspective, and ways of thinking differ from your own. In the patient, genuinely curious kind of conversation in which you are more interested in understanding someone else's view than in sharing your own. The habit of learning from people requires a quality of intellectual humility that is easy to underestimate. It requires approaching conversations not as opportunities to demonstrate what you already know, but as opportunities to encounter something new. It requires resisting the very natural impulse to treat conversations as debates to be won and approaching them instead as collaborations in search of understanding. The people who learn most from others are often not the most talkative people in the room. They are the ones who ask the best questions, who listen in a way that makes people feel genuinely heard, who create the conditions in which others feel safe to think out loud, to share uncertainty, to say things they have not yet worked out completely. This kind of conversation is rare, but when it happens, it is one of the richest sources of learning available to any of us. The third element is learning from experience rather than just having experiences. There is a significant difference between having many experiences and learning from them. People can live through decades of experience and remain largely unchanged by it, because they have never developed the habit of genuinely examining what those experiences have to teach. The reflective practice discussed in an earlier section is essential here. The habit of returning to experience, asking what happened and why, examining your own role and your own assumptions, extracting principles that might generalize, is what transforms raw experience into genuine wisdom. Without this practice, experience accumulates but does not compound. With it, each experience adds to a growing body of understanding that makes subsequent experiences more intelligible and more instructive. The fourth element is embracing the discomfort of not knowing. One of the most common barriers to continuous learning is the discomfort of being a beginner, of not knowing, of being in the position of someone who has more to learn than they have already learned, which is always the position you are in when you begin something genuinely new. This discomfort is real and is worth taking seriously. It is also the price of growth. There is no other path to understanding something new than through the phase of not yet understanding it, and the willingness to tolerate that phase, to remain engaged and curious even when you feel incompetent or confused. is what separates the people who continue to grow from the people who stay within the comfortable boundaries of what they already know. This means actively seeking out the territory at the edge of your understanding. The books that challenge you rather than confirming what you already believe. The conversations that leave you with more questions than answers. The experiences that require you to think in ways that feel unfamiliar, not as a form of self-punishment, but as a recognition that discomfort at the edge of understanding is the signal that learning is actually happening. The fifth element is the practice of teaching what you learn. There is a well-documented phenomenon in education and psychology that teaching something to others is one of the most effective ways to deepen your own understanding of it. When you try to explain something to someone else, you are forced to confront the gaps in your understanding that you could paper over when you were only thinking about it for yourself. You are forced to find language that makes the idea accessible, which requires you to understand it more precisely than you did before, and you are forced to respond to questions which often reveal aspects of the topic you had not considered. You do not need to be a formal teacher to take advantage of this. The habit of explaining ideas to others, of writing about what you have learned in your own words, of discussing new understanding with people in your life, is a powerful way to consolidate and deepen learning. The sixth element is consistency over intensity. One of the most counterproductive patterns in how people approach learning is the intense burst followed by a long absence, the period of enthusiastic engagement that burns out and is not sustained. Continuous learning, as its name suggests, is a practice of regularity. Small, consistent engagement with new ideas and new knowledge produces more durable and more substantial growth than occasional intense efforts. 30 minutes of genuine, focused reading every day will produce more intellectual growth over a year than a month-long intensive course that is not followed by any sustained practice. The goal is not to optimize any single learning session. The goal is to build and maintain a habit of engagement with ideas that does not require motivation or willpower to sustain, because it has become simply part of how you move through your days. This is the difference between learning as an event and learning as a practice. The event can be impressive. The practice is what changes you. Learning continuously does not make you someone who knows everything. No such person exists. But it makes you someone whose picture of the world is consistently getting richer, whose thinking is consistently getting sharper, whose capacity to understand new things is consistently growing rather than standing still. And over time, the compound effect of that growth is remarkable. Every belief you hold rests on assumptions. Some of those assumptions are explicit. You know you are making them, and you could articulate them if asked. But most of them are invisible. They are the premises that feel so obvious, so natural, so simply true, that you have never thought to examine them. They are the background framework through which every experience is filtered and every conclusion is reached. These invisible assumptions are, in many ways, the most powerful forces shaping your thinking. Not the arguments you make or the evidence you weigh, but the deeper, unexamined premises that determine which arguments feel compelling and which evidence feels relevant. The habit of questioning assumptions is the practice of making the invisible visible, of regularly surfacing and examining the background framework that shapes your thinking, of asking not just whether a conclusion is correct, but whether the assumptions that led to it deserve the confidence you have placed in them. This is difficult work. It requires a quality of intellectual courage that is worth naming explicitly, because questioning your assumptions is not a comfortable activity. It means entertaining the possibility that things you have believed for a long time, perhaps things that feel like simply the way the world is, might be wrong or incomplete, or more complicated than you have allowed. Most people avoid this discomfort by never looking directly at their assumptions, by treating them as bedrock rather than as positions that could, in principle, be examined and revised. The cost of this avoidance is a significant narrowing of thought, because the conclusions you can reach are bounded by the assumptions you begin with. If those assumptions are mistaken, your reasoning, however careful, will lead you to mistaken places, and you will arrive there feeling confident because you followed the reasoning. You just never examined the ground it was standing on. Let us think about what questioning assumptions actually looks like. The first form is questioning factual assumptions. These are beliefs about how the world works, about what is true, about what the evidence actually shows. Many of these beliefs were acquired secondhand from sources of varying reliability, filtered through various biases, and accepted without careful examination. The habit here is to periodically ask, how do I actually know this? Not as a form of radical skepticism that doubts everything, but as a genuine inquiry into the epistemic status of your beliefs. Which of the things you believe do you actually have good evidence for? Which of them are you simply assuming because it is what most people around you believe, or because it is what you were taught, or because it fits a narrative that you find compelling for other reasons? This is not comfortable. But it is how beliefs become more accurate over time. The second form is questioning interpretive assumptions. These are the frameworks you bring to events and experiences that determine how you interpret them. The stories you tell yourself about why things happened, about what other people's behavior means, about what a situation requires from you. These interpretive frameworks are often largely invisible. They operate below the level of conscious reasoning, shaping your perception of events before you have had a chance to analyze them. And they are shaped by a complex mixture of past experience, cultural conditioning, and emotional habit. Questioning interpretive assumptions involves asking, is this interpretation actually the most accurate one? Are there other ways to make sense of what happened? What would I conclude if I started from different premises? This is particularly important in interpersonal situations where the meaning of someone's behavior is almost always genuinely ambiguous, but where we tend to resolve that ambiguity quickly and confidently in the direction that fits our existing story about the person or the situation. The third form is questioning normative assumptions. These are beliefs about how things ought to be. What counts as success? What constitutes a good life? What people owe each other? What is worth caring about? These assumptions are perhaps the most deeply held and the most rarely examined, because they feel not like positions we have taken, but like simply the way things are. And yet they vary enormously across cultures, across generations, across individuals who were raised in different contexts. What seems obviously true about how a life should be lived to someone in one culture or generation can seem completely foreign to someone raised in a different one. Examining normative assumptions does not mean abandoning your values. It means understanding them as positions, as things you actually believe rather than simply as the natural order of things. And it means remaining open to the possibility that they can be refined and developed through reflection and encounter with other perspectives. The fourth form is questioning methodological assumptions. These are the assumptions embedded in how you approach problems, in what counts as evidence, in what kinds of reasoning you trust, in the tools and frameworks you default to when trying to understand something. Every domain of knowledge has methodological assumptions, ways of approaching questions that are so ingrained that they rarely get examined. And sometimes those methodological assumptions, when applied in contexts where they do not quite fit, produce systematic errors that are invisible from inside the methodology. Questioning methodological assumptions requires stepping outside the framework you habitually use to think about problems, which is one of the most cognitively demanding things you can do. But it is also one of the things that most reliably produces genuine intellectual innovation. The habit of questioning assumptions does not mean doubting everything all the time. That would be paralyzing and unproductive. It means holding your assumptions a little more lightly, returning to them with some regularity, maintaining the recognition that the most dangerous errors in thinking are usually the ones that feel most obviously correct. It means cultivating a quality that is sometimes called intellectual humility, a genuine openness to the possibility that you are wrong, combined with the courage to examine that possibility rather than defending against it. People who practice this habit are, paradoxically, often more confident than those who do not in a brittle, defensive way, but in the settled, durable way of someone who has actually examined the ground they are standing on and found it solid, at least solid enough for now, with the recognition that they will keep examining it. The quality of thinking that this habit produces is worth the discomfort of the practice. A mind that questions its own assumptions is a mind that is getting closer to the truth over time. A mind that never examines its assumptions is a mind that can be confident in the wrong direction for as long as it manages to avoid the evidence that would challenge it. That is a kind of confidence that has no real value. Every day you make dozens of decisions. Most of them are small. What to eat, what to read, how to spend the next hour, whose message to answer first. But some of them are not small at all. How to respond to a significant challenge, whether to take an opportunity or let it pass, what to prioritize when everything feels urgent, how to navigate a situation in which the right path is not clear. The quality of these decisions, accumulated over months and years, shapes the trajectory of your life in ways that are easy to underestimate in any individual moment. The habit of clear decision making is not about developing a formula that tells you what to choose. No such formula exists, and anyone who claims to offer you one is selling something that will not work. It is about developing a quality of process, a set of practices that, applied consistently, produce better decisions over time than the alternative of deciding by instinct, by impulse, or by default. Let us think carefully about what stands in the way of clear decision-making. The first obstacle is emotional interference. Decisions made in moments of strong emotion, whether fear, excitement, anger, or the desire to avoid discomfort, tend to overweight the emotional signal relative to the actual evidence and likely consequences. The purchase you make because you are in a good mood. The commitment you make because you do not want to disappoint someone. The action you take because the discomfort of not acting is greater than the discomfort of choosing badly. Emotional intelligence, in the context of decision-making, means not the suppression of emotion, which is neither possible nor desirable, but the capacity to recognize when an emotion is distorting your evaluation of a situation, to notice that you are deciding from fear or excitement, and to pause long enough to examine the decision with a cooler kind of attention. This is not always possible in the moment. Some decisions must be made quickly, in conditions of emotional activation, with imperfect information. But for decisions that have real stakes and allow for deliberation, the habit of checking in with your emotional state and asking what it might be doing to your evaluation is a genuinely valuable practice. The second obstacle is cognitive bias. The field of behavioral economics has spent decades documenting the systematic ways in which human thinking departs from rationality. The tendency to weight losses more heavily than gains. The tendency to be anchored by the first number you hear. The tendency to feel overconfident in familiar territory. The tendency to see patterns in randomness. The tendency to explain successes as the product of skill and failures as the product of bad luck. These are not weaknesses that can be simply overcome through willpower. They are features of how human cognition works, deeply embedded in the architecture of thought. But they can be partially compensated for through awareness. The habit of clear decision-making involves knowing your own predictable patterns of error, understanding which biases you are most susceptible to in which kinds of situations, and building checks into your process that create at least some friction against the most consequential of those biases. This might mean deliberately seeking out information that contradicts your current inclination before finalizing a decision. It might mean consulting someone whose perspective you know differs from yours. It might mean simply waiting, when waiting is possible, and observing whether the decision looks the same after 24 hours as it did in the moment. The third obstacle is the confusion of urgency and importance. Many decisions feel urgent and are not particularly important. Many important decisions do not feel urgent at all. The human attention system is naturally drawn to what is loud and immediate, which means that genuinely important decisions that do not announce themselves with urgency tend to get less deliberate attention than they deserve. The habit of clear decision-making involves developing a kind of meta-awareness about which decisions deserve the most careful thought, not the ones that feel most pressing in the moment, the ones that have the largest long-term consequences, the ones that are hardest to reverse, the ones that determine the context in which many subsequent decisions will be made. Giving your best thinking to those decisions, rather than to the urgent but less consequential ones, is one of the highest leverage practices available. The fourth element is the value of simplicity in evaluation criteria. When faced with a complex decision, the temptation is to try to evaluate every relevant factor simultaneously, to construct a comprehensive analysis that accounts for all the variables. This is admirable in its ambition, but it can also lead to analysis paralysis, in which the complexity of the evaluation prevents any decision from being made. The habit of clear decision-making often involves identifying the 2 or 3 factors that matter most in a given decision and giving them disproportionate weight, not ignoring other factors, but recognizing that a small number of considerations typically drive the outcome, and that clarity about those considerations is more valuable than exhaustive coverage of everything that could theoretically be relevant. This requires judgment about what the most important factors actually are, and that judgment improves with practice, with experience, and with the reflective habit of revisiting past decisions to understand what actually drove their outcomes. The fifth element is learning from outcomes. Decisions have outcomes, and those outcomes contain information that can improve future decisions, but only if you create the practice of examining them. This requires distinguishing between the quality of a decision and the quality of its outcome. A good decision, made with reasonable information and careful reasoning, can produce a bad outcome because the world is uncertain and outcomes depend on factors beyond your control. A bad decision can produce a good outcome through luck. Judging decisions primarily by their outcomes is a common error that corrupts the learning process. It leads to overconfidence when luck produces good results from poor reasoning, and to unwarranted doubt when careful reasoning is undone by unforeseeable circumstances. The habit of examining decisions involves asking, given what I knew at the time I decided, was the reasoning sound? Was the process of evaluation careful? Would I make the same decision again under the same information conditions? The answer to those questions tells you something real about the quality of your decision-making. The outcome tells you about the state of the world. Both matter, but they measure different things. The sixth element is the practice of pre-deciding. One of the most effective ways to improve decision-making is to decide in advance, in moments of calm reflection, how you will respond to predictable future situations, to make commitments to yourself about your own behavior before you are in the situation that will test those commitments. This works because decisions made in advance are not subject to the emotional pressures and cognitive distortions of the moment. When you decide calmly and in advance that you will not check your phone during the first 2 hours of your morning, you are making that decision in a moment when you have access to your most reflective thinking. When the moment arrives, you are not deciding under the influence of the immediate desire. You are simply keeping a commitment that your more reflective self already made. This principle applies across the full range of decisions, in relationships, in work, in health, in how you spend your time. The habit of thinking through, in advance and in calm moments, how you want to respond to foreseeable challenges, and then treating those responses as commitments rather than as fresh decisions, reduces the number of moments in which your thinking is most likely to fail you. Clear decision-making, practiced as a habit, does not guarantee perfect outcomes. The world is too uncertain for that. But it does produce, over time, a track record of decisions that are well-reasoned, consistently aligned with what you actually value, and genuinely informed by what you have learned from past experience. That kind of decision-making, accumulated over years, is one of the most significant expressions of practical intelligence available to any person. You have spent this time listening to ideas about how the mind works and how it grows. Not ideas designed to impress you, not ideas designed to feel inspirational in the moment and fade by the end of the day. Ideas that are, in their substance, about the patient, quiet, daily work of becoming a more thoughtful person. Let us take a moment to return to the beginning. You started this audiobook with an assumption that most people carry, often without examining it. The assumption that intelligence is largely fixed, that some people simply got more of it than others, and that the gap between them is not something you can meaningfully close. What this audiobook has tried to show you through careful argument and through the examination of real habits is that this assumption, though understandable, is incomplete. The most practically significant form of intelligence, the ability to think clearly, to observe carefully, to learn consistently, to question thoughtfully, to decide wisely, is not a fixed quantity handed out at birth. It is a direction. It is a quality of engagement with the world and with your own mind, and it is shaped, day by day and year by year, by the habits you practice. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the most hopeful and the most demanding thing that can be said about intelligence. It is hopeful because it means the gap between where you are and where you could be is not sealed shut by the accident of your birth. It is traversable, not through a single breakthrough or a dramatic transformation, but through the patient, consistent practice of habits that keep the mind alive, growing, and engaged. It is demanding because it places the responsibility where it belongs, with you, with the choices you make every day about how to direct your attention, what to think about carefully, whether to reflect or react, whether to question or accept, whether to engage deeply or to skim the surface and move on. There is no shortcut. There never was. The habit of observation grows through the daily practice of actually looking at the world around you more carefully than you need to, through resisting the default of filtered, automatic perception and choosing, with some regularity, to see what is actually there. The habit of deep thinking grows through protecting time for genuine reflection, through choosing the effortful path of analysis when it would be easier to stop at the first comfortable conclusion, through sitting with the complexity of the world rather than reducing it to the simplicity that is easier to hold. The habit of controlling attention grows through the daily discipline of directing your focus deliberately, through protecting your best thinking for your most important work, through the quiet resistance against the forces that would fragment your concentration into something too shallow for serious thought. The habit of continuous learning grows through the sustained practice of reading, listening, and engaging with ideas that are genuinely new to you, through the willingness to be a beginner, through finding in the discomfort of not yet knowing a signal that something real is happening. The habit of questioning assumptions grows through the intellectual courage to look directly at the foundations of your beliefs, through the willingness to discover that some of what felt like bedrock is actually position, and through the understanding that beliefs which survive examination are more valuable than beliefs which have never been tested. The habit of clear decision making grows through the patient development of a process, through learning from your own history of choices, through the discipline of deciding calmly what your best self would do before you are under the pressures that make thinking hardest. None of these habits are finished. None of them reach a point of completion. They are ongoing practices, things you do not once but continuously, because the mind does not arrive at a destination. It is always in process, always either growing or narrowing, always either being cultivated or allowed to settle. The question is simply which direction it moves in on any given day, in any given choice. There is something worth saying about what this kind of growth actually feels like from the inside. It does not feel dramatic. There is no moment of transformation in which you suddenly become a different kind of thinker. The change is quieter than that. It is the gradual accumulation of small shifts. The question you would not have thought to ask 6 months ago. The pattern you notice that would have been invisible to you a year earlier. The decision you make calmly and clearly in a situation that would previously have found you reactive and confused. These small shifts compound, not in a linear way, but in the way that genuine growth compounds, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, until one day you look back, and the distance between who you were and who you are is greater than you expected from where you started. This is what the people who seem effortlessly intelligent have usually actually done. They have not been given something you were not. They have practiced something you have not yet, or not yet as consistently or as intentionally. They have built habits that kept their minds alive, and you can do the same. Not because this audiobook told you to, not through a burst of motivation that will fade, but through the kind of quiet, durable commitment that comes from genuinely understanding why it matters, from recognizing that the quality of your thinking shapes the quality of your experience and your choices and your relationships and your work in ways that are too significant to leave to chance. The mind you have at 50 is not the mind you were born with. It is, in large measure, the mind you built. Through what you paid attention to, what you chose to think about carefully, what you chose to learn, what you allowed yourself to question. Every day offers you the chance to build it in a direction you are proud of. Not through perfection, not through the impossible standard of thinking clearly in every moment under every pressure, but through the sustained, imperfect, quietly courageous practice of doing better more often than you did yesterday. That is enough. That is, in fact, more than enough. Intelligence is not built in one moment. It is shaped quietly, day by day, by the way you choose to think. And that choice is always, and only yours,